There are moments when the quiet presses against the chest in a way that feels heavier than noise. Moments when the world slows down, not because things are peaceful, but because waiting has stretched longer than expected. I have learned that silence can carry fear and hope at the same time. It can hold exhaustion, questions, and a kind of patience that is not chosen, but learned over time. This was one of those moments. The sky was still dark when I stopped walking, not because I felt safe, but because my body could not go much farther. My feet ached from days of moving without rest, and my thoughts felt just as tired. I leaned against the cool stone of the hillside and listened. No voices, no footsteps, only the wind moving through the grass, slow and steady, as if the land itself was breathing. I had been running for days, not running toward something, but away. Away from a man who once welcomed me into his house. Away from a king whose favor had turned into suspicion, then into anger. Away from a life that once felt clear, ordered, and hopeful. There are times when fear does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly. At first it is only a feeling you cannot explain, a look that lingers too long, a silence where there should be warmth. That is how it began with Saul. I did not wake up one morning knowing I would become a hunted man. It unfolded slowly, like a shadow stretching longer each day, until I could no longer ignore it. I used to stand in the court and play my harp, watching his shoulders relax as the music filled the room. I remember believing that peace could be restored with the right melody, the right moment. I remember thinking that faithfulness and loyalty would be enough. But hearts can change, even when the songs stay the same. Now, the only music around me was the wind. As I sat there, listening, I became aware of how alone I was. Not in the way of being forgotten, but in the way that strips everything down to what is real. No titles, no crowd, no applause, just breath, fear, and the sound of my own heartbeat. I wondered how many others had felt this same quiet. How many had sat somewhere unseen, carrying questions they could not speak aloud. Waiting, wondering if anyone understood what it cost to keep going when stopping felt easier. That thought stayed with me, because even though I was alone, I knew this feeling was not mine alone. The hills around me were familiar. I had walked them as a shepherd, guiding sheep through these same valleys when life was simpler. Back then, the land felt open and safe. Now every ridge felt like a place someone could be watching from. Every narrow path felt like it could lead to a dead end. Still, there was something steady about the land. The rocks did not rush. The trees did not panic. They stood where they were, rooted, patient. I found myself drawing strength from their stillness. I thought about the promises spoken over my life, words spoken quietly, almost unbelievably, about a future I had never chased, a future that now felt impossibly far away. I did not understand how those words could be true while my life looked like this: running, hiding, sleeping lightly, trusting carefully. If I am honest, there were moments when I wanted to speak back into the darkness, to ask why the path had narrowed so suddenly, why obedience had led here. Those questions did not feel rebellious. They felt human. I have learned that many of the deepest questions are not shouted. They are carried silently, step after step, mile after mile. As the light began to shift, I stood and continued walking, slowfully, each step measured, not just to avoid being seen, but to conserve strength. Hunger had become familiar, so had thirst, but there was a deeper hunger beneath both, a longing to understand what this season was shaping in me. Leadership had once seemed like a distant idea, something for later. something tied to honor and responsibility. Now, I was learning it in the hardest way possible, alone, vulnerable, dependent on wisdom rather than strength. I began to see that power without restraint destroys, that fear, when left unchecked, can turn a man against those closest to him. And I felt a quiet resolve growing in me. Whatever became of my life, I did not want to become ruled by the same fear I was fleeing from. There are thoughts like that which linger. They settle deep. If you have ever noticed certain moments shaping you without noise or announcement, you understand what I mean. Those moments rarely feel important at the time, yet they stay. As I reached a narrow pass between the rocks, I paused again, not because I heard danger, but because something inside me needed stillness. I placed my hand against the stone and felt its rough surface, solid, unmoving. It reminded me that not everything shifts with fear. I thought about the stories people tell later, how they speak of courage as if it arrives fully formed. But courage often begins quietly, in places like this. In choosing not to surrender to bitterness. In choosing not to strike back when anger feels justified. In choosing patience when revenge feels faster. If someone were to hear this story one day, I wonder what they would notice. The running, perhaps. The danger. Or maybe the waiting. The long stretches where nothing seemed to change, yet everything was changing inside. If these thoughts sound familiar, it may be because waiting shapes many lives in unseen ways. And sometimes speaking about it, even quietly, helps others realize they are not alone in it. I continued forward as the sun finally rose, lighting the hills in soft gold. The danger was still real. Saul was still searching. Nothing had been resolved. Yet something steady had taken root within me. I was still afraid, but I was learning how to walk with that fear instead of being ruled by it. And as the path unfolded beneath my feet, I held on to one quiet truth. Even in exile, even in uncertainty, a life can still be shaped with purpose. Sometimes, sharing the weight of those thoughts, even silently, makes the journey lighter for others who are walking similar paths. So I walked on, not knowing where the road would end, only knowing that each step mattered more than I once understood. The wilderness teaches slowly. It does not explain itself. It simply waits, and over time, it reveals what cannot be learned anywhere else. Days passed, marked not by calendars or announcements, but by the movement of the sun and the ache in my legs. I learned how to wake before the light, how to move while the air was still cool, how to rest only when it was necessary. Each choice mattered. Where I stepped, how long I lingered, whether I trusted a path that looked easy or chose the longer, quieter way instead. There were places where the land opened wide, and places where it narrowed into tight passes between rock and shadow. In those narrow places, sound carried differently. A single footstep could echo. A loose stone could betray you. I learned to listen more than I moved, to let silence guide me. Caves became familiar. Some were shallow, offering little more than shade. Others reached deep into the earth, their darkness thick and cool. Inside them, the air felt heavy, still. I would sit just inside the entrance, far enough back to be hidden, close enough to see the light outside. That balance mattered. Too far in and you lost awareness. Too close and you risked being seen. It was in those caves that my thoughts grew loud. When there is nothing to distract you, the mind begins to speak more clearly. Memories surfaced without warning. Moments of joy. Words spoken in confidence. Promises that now felt distant. I remembered standing before Saul, believing my place was secure. I remembered the sound of celebration after battles won, and the way approval can feel like safety. Now safety was measured differently. Safety was silence, shadows, the ability to remain unseen. There were moments when resentment tried to take root. It arrived quietly, disguised as reason. I could feel it whispering that this was unfair. That loyalty should have protected me. That obedience should have led somewhere easier. Those thoughts did not shout. They settled in slowly, like dust. I had to learn how to let them pass. I discovered that bitterness grows best when fed with isolation. So I spoke aloud sometimes, quietly, not to be heard by others, but to keep my own heart open. I spoke of gratitude even when it felt thin. I spoke of trust even when it felt fragile. Not because I always believed the words fully, but because speaking them reminded me of who I did not want to become. There is a difference between hiding and hardening. The wilderness can push you toward either. Food was scarce. Water was precious. I learned to recognize small signs of provision. A stream hidden behind reeds, berries clinging to a rocky slope. Each small finding felt like a reminder that survival did not depend on strength alone, but on awareness, patience, and care. I began to understand how easy it is for a person to become harsh when life becomes hard. Hunger does that. Fear does that. Waiting does that. And yet I sensed that this season was shaping me in ways comfort never could. At night the sky felt endless. Stars scattered across it like quiet witnesses. I would lie on the ground, my cloak pulled tight, and look upward. The same sky stretched over the palace, over Saul, over everyone I had left behind. That thought steadied me. It reminded me that even when paths separate, we remain under the same covering. Sometimes the loneliness pressed in heavily. Not the absence of people alone, but the absence of certainty. There were no clear answers about how long this would last, or how it would end. That kind of not knowing can wear a person down. If you have ever lived through a season without a timeline, you understand the weight of that uncertainty. Days blur together. Hope must be renewed quietly, again and again. There is no finish line in sight, only the decision to keep moving forward. I found myself thinking about mercy more often, about what it means to restrain power, about how easy it would be if given the chance to act from anger instead of wisdom. Those thoughts unsettled me, but they also sharpened me. I did not want survival to cost me my character. There were moments when I imagined what others might say if they knew where I was, how they might judge the choices I made or misunderstand the reasons for them. But the wilderness has a way of stripping away the need for approval. Out here, survival mattered more than reputation. And yet, I still felt connected to others in an unexpected way. In my quiet reflections, I often wondered how many people carry their own unseen caves, how many hide not from enemies, but from disappointment, grief, or unanswered questions. Those thoughts made me gentler, less quick to judge, more aware of the invisible battles people fight. If someone were to hear these reflections someday, I hope they would not hear strength alone. I hope they would hear honesty, the kind that admits fear without surrendering to it, the kind that keeps walking, even when the path feels unclear. As days turned into nights and nights back into days, I felt something steady forming within me. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in restraint, in waiting, in trusting that clarity often comes after endurance, not before it. The wilderness did not offer comfort, but it offered truth. It showed me who I was when no one was watching. It revealed the cost of fear and the quiet strength of patience. It taught me that leadership begins long before authority, and that mercy must be practiced before it is ever required. I continued to move carefully through the land, carrying these lessons with me. Each step still mattered. The danger had not passed. Saul's pursuit had not ended. But my heart was changing, slowly, deliberately. And sometimes as I walked, I thought about how stories like this are often remembered for their turning points, the dramatic moments, the visible outcomes. But the unseen days, the long stretches of quiet endurance, shape a person just as deeply. If these thoughts echo something familiar within you, it may be because waiting has a way of connecting lives across time, and sometimes acknowledging that shared experience, even silently, helps carry the weight a little more gently. So I kept walking, through caves and valleys, through hunger and reflection, learning, step by step, that the wilderness was not only a place of hiding, but a place of becoming. I did not expect companionship to find me in the wilderness. I had learned to move as if I were alone, to think as if every sound might mean danger. But the hills have a way of gathering those who have been pushed to the edges. And slowly, without ceremony, others began to appear. At first it was cautious, a distant figure on a ridge, a shape standing too still among the rocks. We watched one another for a long moment, each deciding whether the other was threat or refuge. Trust does not arrive quickly when survival depends on caution. It must be tested, measured, proven in small ways. They came as men weighed down by their own burdens. Some were worn by debt, others by loss, others by quiet discontent they could not name. They did not arrive as warriors with banners or confidence. They arrived tired, hungry, watchful, much like I was. We did not speak much at first. Words felt unnecessary. Shared silence told us enough. We learned one another's rhythms by observation. Who slept lightly, who kept watch without complaint, who moved carefully, aware of the cost of noise. Leadership, I learned, does not begin with commands. It begins with presence. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on me in a new way. Not because I sought authority, but because it was needed. These men had followed me into uncertainty. Their lives were now tied to my decisions. That knowledge kept me awake at night more than fear ever had. We shared food when we had it. We shared silence when we did not. Hunger is easier to bear when it is not faced alone. Fear, too, loses some of its sharpness when it is spoken quietly among those who understand it. There were moments when laughter surprised us, brief, unguarded, almost startling in its suddenness. It reminded us that we were still human, not just fugitives. Those moments did not last long, but they mattered. They softened the edges of our days. One day, word reached me that Jonathan was nearby. The sound of his name stirred something deep within me. He was not just the king's son. He was my friend. A man whose loyalty had never been shaped by fear or ambition. In a world where trust had become fragile, Jonathan had always been steady. When we met, there were no grand gestures, no speeches, just two men standing in the wilderness, aware of what it cost to be there. His presence felt like a reminder of a life I had once known, and of the kind of loyalty that does not depend on circumstance. He spoke with honesty, about his father's growing resolve, about the danger that still followed me. He did not offer false comfort. He offered clarity. And then something more valuable. He reminded me of what had been spoken over my life, not as a challenge to his own future, but as an act of trust. He strengthened my hand, not with strategy, but with reassurance that faithfulness still existed, even within the house of a king. That moment stayed with me long after he left. It reminded me that encouragement does not always remove danger, but it can restore strength. If you have ever been steady for someone else during their hardest season, you understand this quiet power. And if you have ever received that kind of encouragement, you know how deeply it settles. As our group grew, so did the complexity of our days. More people meant more needs, more opinions, more risk. Decisions could no longer be made for myself alone. Each path chosen affected many. I began to understand how easily fear can shape leadership, how tempting it is to act quickly, harshly, just to feel control. But the wilderness had already taught me restraint. Now the presence of others demanded it even more. There were disagreements, tensions, moments when exhaustion made tempers short. I learned that listening often mattered more than speaking, that allowing space for others to be heard did not weaken authority but strengthened trust. Sometimes I wondered how these men saw me, as a leader, as a refuge, as a risk. Those thoughts humbled me. They kept me from imagining myself as more than I was, a man still learning, still waiting. At night, when the camp settled and the fires burned low, I would sit slightly apart, listening to the sounds of rest, breathing, shifting cloaks, quiet murmurs fading into sleep. In those moments, the weight of shared lives pressed gently but firmly against my heart. If this story were told later, people might focus on the gathering of men, the forming of a following. But what mattered most to me were the unseen moments. The decisions made quietly. The patience practiced when fear urged haste. The restraint chosen when power seemed within reach. I often thought about how many people walk through life carrying others with them. Family, friends, responsibilities they did not ask for yet cannot abandon. Those journeys are rarely noticed, yet they shape character deeply. Sometimes simply acknowledging that shared weight helps. Speaking about it, writing it down, letting others know they are not alone in it. Those small acts of sharing can become anchors in long seasons of waiting. Our path continued through hills and valleys, marked by caution and care. Saul's pursuit still loomed, unrelenting, but I was no longer walking alone, and that changed the way fear felt. It was still present, but it was shared, and shared burdens, even heavy ones, sit differently on the soul. I learned that community does not remove danger, but it can steady the heart. It can remind a person why restraint matters, why mercy must be guarded, why leadership begins with humility. As we moved on together, I carried these lessons quietly, knowing that the wilderness was no longer shaping me alone, but shaping all of us, preparing us not just for survival, but for the kind of choices that would one day matter far beyond these hidden paths. And so we walked on, not certain of outcomes, still hunted, still waiting, but learning together how faithfulness, patience, and shared resolve can grow even in the most uncertain ground. Danger has a way of drawing close when you least expect it. Not always with noise or warning, but with a sudden narrowing of space, a tightening of the air, a sense that the room for error has grown very small. There were days when Saul's pursuit felt distant, almost imagined. And then there were days like this, when it felt as if the land itself was closing in. We had moved into a region where the hills rose sharply and the paths folded in on themselves. The ground was uneven, scattered with loose stones that shifted underfoot. Movement here required care. One wrong sound could travel farther than intended. One careless decision could place many lives at risk. Word reached us quietly. Saul was near. Not a rumor this time. Not uncertainty. He was close enough that his presence could be felt before it was seen. The men around me grew quieter. Their movements slowed. Conversations ended before they began. Fear does that. It does not always speak. Sometimes it simply stills everything. We found a cave just large enough to shelter us. Its mouth was wide, but the inside bent sharply, forming a dark pocket that hid us from view. We moved inside without haste, knowing that panic would betray us faster than patience. Cloaks brushed against stone, breathing softened. The light from outside faded as we pressed deeper into the shadows. Inside the cave, time stretched. No one spoke. Every sound felt too loud, even the quiet shifting of weight. I could hear my own breath, controlled, measured. I could hear the faint sounds of life outside. Footsteps, voices, the unmistakable presence of men searching. Saul's men passed close enough that I could make out the rhythm of their steps. I knew those rhythms. I had once walked among them freely. Now every step they took tightened something in my chest. This was the kind of moment where choices form quickly, even if action does not. Where the mind races ahead, measuring outcomes, consequences, possibilities. I was aware of my men watching me from the darkness, waiting, trusting me to decide what came next. Leadership is tested most deeply when fear presses hardest. There was a thought that surfaced quietly, almost without invitation. The idea that danger could be ended here. That this long season of hiding could be resolved with one decisive act. It did not arrive with cruelty. It arrived with reason, with the logic of survival. I did not act on it, not because I was fearless, but because something deeper resisted it. I had seen what fear-driven decisions had done to Saul. I had watched how insecurity twists judgment, how power grasped too tightly becomes destructive. I did not want my story shaped by the same force. The cave held us in silence as the moment passed. Saul did not enter. His men moved on. The sound of their footsteps slowly faded, replaced by the low, steady sound of wind outside. Only then did breath return fully to the space. Relief came, but it was not clean or simple. It carried with it the weight of what might have been, the knowledge that power, once glimpsed, can linger in the mind. That restraint often costs more than action, at least in the moment. I sat there long after the danger had moved on, thinking about how close the line can be between preservation and compromise. How easily justification can disguise itself as necessity. These are not lessons learned quickly. They are learned through repetition, through moments where restraint must be chosen again and again. If you have ever faced a decision where the easier path conflicted with the right one, you understand the tension I felt. Those moments rarely come with clarity. They come with pressure, with urgency, with voices that insist there is no time to think. The wilderness had taught me to think anyway. We moved from the cave once it was safe, emerging into the light carefully, one by one. No one spoke about what had almost happened. It did not need to be said. Silence carried the understanding between us. As we walked, I felt the weight of responsibility settle even deeper. These men trusted me not only with their safety, but with the kind of leader I was becoming. My choices were shaping more than outcomes. They were shaping character, mine and theirs. There were moments when I wondered how many lives are altered quietly, not by what people do, but by what they refuse to do. Those stories are rarely celebrated, yet they form the backbone of integrity. Later that evening, as we made camp, I found myself reflecting on how fear sharpens the desire for control. When life feels unstable, the temptation to seize certainty can become overwhelming. But certainty gained through compromise leaves a residue that does not fade easily. I watched the fire burn low, its light flickering against the faces of the men as they rested. Each of them carried their own fears, their own questions, and still they followed. That trust humbled me. It reminded me that leadership is not proven in moments of triumph, but in moments of restraint. When power is available but not taken. When fear demands speed but wisdom chooses patience. I thought about how these moments are often invisible to others. How people may never know the decisions that shaped a life simply because they were not acted upon. And yet, those unseen choices matter deeply. Sometimes, sharing reflections like these helps others name their own quiet struggles. It helps people realize that choosing restraint does not mean weakness, and that patience is not the absence of courage. If someone hears this and recognizes their own tension within it, that recognition alone carries value. As the night deepened, the danger still lingered somewhere beyond the hills. Saul's pursuit had not ended. The threat remained real. But something within me felt steadier, not because the situation had improved, but because clarity had been chosen over impulse. I lay down knowing that tomorrow would bring new risks, new decisions, new opportunities to respond either from fear or from faithfulness. The wilderness was relentless in its lessons, but I was learning to meet them without haste. And as sleep finally came, I held on to one quiet understanding, that the path forward was not defined by how quickly danger could be removed, but by how carefully the heart could be guarded while walking through it. There are seasons when movement slows, not because danger has passed, but because the soul needs space to catch its breath. After the close calls, after the long stretches of alertness, something within me began to crave stillness. Not the kind that ignores reality, but the kind that allows the heart to settle enough to listen. We remained hidden for a time, moving only when necessary. The men understood without explanation. Their bodies carried the same weariness mine did. Even courage grows tired when it is stretched day after day. In those quieter stretches, I found myself turning inward more often, not away from the world, but toward what was shaping me beneath the surface. When noise fades, patterns emerge. Thoughts return again and again until they are faced. I would sit apart from the others, early in the morning or late at night, when the air was cool and the land felt hushed. The sky would be pale with first light or heavy with stars, and I would let my breathing slow. These were not dramatic moments. There were no visions or sudden answers, only a steady awareness of being held in something larger than fear. Prayer in those days was not formal. It did not follow structure. It came as quiet honesty, as naming what I felt without polishing it. Fear, fatigue, gratitude, confusion, hope that felt thin but persistent. I spoke to the Lord as I would to someone who already knew me fully. There was no need to impress, no need to hide disappointment or longing. If anything, the wilderness had stripped away the need for performance. I noticed how my thoughts often returned to the same questions. How long will this last? What is this preparing me for? Why must waiting teach so much through discomfort? I did not demand answers. I had learned that some understanding arrives only after endurance has done its work. The men rested more easily during this time. They trusted the quiet. Trust, I have learned, grows when leaders are not always rushing forward. When stillness is allowed, it signals confidence that survival does not depend on constant motion. I thought about the songs that had once come easily to me. Music had always been a way to speak what could not be said plainly. In the wilderness, those songs returned differently, slower, simpler, shaped by dust and silence rather than celebration. I would hum softly at times, barely above a whisper, not to perform, but to steady myself. The melodies carried prayers without needing many words. They held sorrow and hope together without forcing them apart. There is something grounding about giving shape to what lives inside. Whether through song, writing, or quiet reflection, it allows weight to be carried rather than stored. I began to understand how these practices preserve the heart when circumstances offer little comfort. If someone listening to this has ever found relief simply by putting their thoughts into words, even privately, then they understand the gift those moments gave me. Expression does not remove hardship, but it prevents it from hardening the spirit. I also reflected deeply on Saul during these times, not with anger, but with a kind of sober understanding. Fear had narrowed his world. Power had isolated him. I could see how easily I might follow the same path if I were not careful. That realization did not excuse his actions, but it softened my judgment. It reminded me that becoming hardened often begins long before harm is done. It begins when listening stops, when fear is left unexamined. I did not want my life shaped that way. The wilderness had become a place of instruction. Not loud or demanding, but persistent. Each day reinforced the same lesson. That character is formed in private long before it is tested in public. That restraint practiced when unseen becomes instinct when pressure arrives. Sometimes one of the men would sit nearby during these quiet moments, not speaking, just present. Shared silence has its own language. It communicates trust without needing explanation. I noticed how these quieter days affected us all. Tempers softened, decisions felt less rushed. Even the land seemed gentler when we allowed ourselves to move with its rhythm instead of against it. Of course, danger had not disappeared. Scouts still listened for movement. Paths were still chosen carefully, but vigilance no longer consumed every thought. Balance had returned. There are seasons in life where nothing visibly changes, yet everything beneath the surface does. These are often the most misunderstood seasons. They look unproductive, empty, but they are often the most formative. If someone hears this and feels they're in such a season, perhaps they will recognize its value. Not immediately, but quietly. Over time. As the days passed, I felt a deeper steadiness take root. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in process. Trust that faithfulness practiced daily, even without reward, shapes something durable. I thought often about the future, not with detailed plans, but with intention. I imagined a life where decisions would affect many more than they did now. A life where restraint would matter even more, where mercy would need to be chosen publicly, not just privately. Those thoughts did not frighten me. They sobered me. I realized that this time of quiet was not a pause in my story. It was preparation. A slow, deliberate forming of instincts that could not be rushed. As night fell on one such day, I sat alone again, listening to the familiar sounds of rest around me, the crackle of a low fire, the soft shifting of bodies settling into sleep, the land breathing in darkness. I felt gratitude then, not for the danger, but for the shaping, not for the fear, but for the clarity it had forced upon me. Gratitude that my life was being refined in ways comfort never could. The path ahead was still uncertain. Saul still lived. The threat remained. Nothing external had resolved. Yet inwardly, something had. I lay down with a quieter heart than I had known in a long time. Not because answers had come, but because trust had deepened, and that I was learning was enough to carry me forward. The wilderness had given me more than shelter. It had given me space to listen, to be honest, and to become someone capable of walking patiently into whatever awaited beyond these hidden hills. The quiet did not last forever. It never does. Just when stillness begins to feel familiar, life shifts again, reminding you that waiting and movement often take turns shaping a person. News reached us slowly, carried by whispers and careful listening. Saul's pursuit had intensified. His resolve had hardened. What once felt like scattered searching now felt focused, deliberate. He was no longer reacting. He was hunting. I could feel the change before it was spoken. The men moved differently. Their eyes stayed alert longer. Sleep came lighter. Even the land seemed less forgiving, its paths narrower, its hiding places fewer. We began moving again, more frequently now. Longer distances, fewer pauses. The balance we had found between stillness and vigilance shifted back toward caution. Each decision carried greater weight. Where we rested, how long we stayed, which routes we avoided. There were moments when exhaustion pressed hard against my resolve, the kind of weariness that settles deeper than the body. It whispers that endurance has limits, that patience has been tested long enough. I understood that voice well, but I had also learned that responding to it too quickly can undo what has been carefully formed. Fear often disguises itself as urgency. It insists that action must be taken immediately, without reflection. I had seen where that path leads, so I listened, but I did not obey it. As Saul drew closer, opportunities appeared that I had not sought. Situations where power felt nearer than before. Moments where my men looked to me with expectation, not just for safety, but for resolution. I felt the tension in their glances. They were tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of waiting for a future that seemed always just beyond reach. I did not blame them. If anything, their weariness mirrored my own. Leadership does not remove fatigue. It multiplies it. You carry not only your own uncertainty, but the weight of others who depend on your judgment. There were nights when sleep escaped me. I would lie awake listening to the steady breathing around me, wondering how long a person can walk faithfully without seeing the road open ahead. These are not doubts born of disbelief. They are questions born of endurance. I found myself returning often to the lessons the wilderness had already taught me. That restraint practiced in private must be carried into public moments. That care is not proven by what is possible, but by what is refused. Saul's fear had grown into obsession. I could sense it. He was no longer protecting a throne. He was protecting an image of control. And the more he tightened his grip, the more unstable he became. I did not want my life shaped by reacting to that instability. There were moments when we stood close enough to Saul's forces to hear their movement, their voices carried on the wind. It was unsettling. To be so near to the source of danger without being seen, to know how quickly circumstances could shift. In those moments I felt the temptation to resolve everything sharply, to end the pursuit decisively, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion, out of a desire for rest. But exhaustion is not a trustworthy guide. I reminded myself again and again that waiting is not weakness, that patience, when chosen deliberately, is an act of strength, that mercy withheld or given defines a person more deeply than victory ever could. Sometimes as we moved through the land, I wondered how these choices would be understood if anyone ever heard this story. Would they see wisdom or hesitation, faithfulness, or fear? Those questions surfaced often, but I learned not to let them steer me. Approval is a poor compass. What mattered was alignment, with what I believed to be right, with the kind of leader I hoped to become, with the restraint that had been forming quietly within me long before power ever felt close. If someone listening to this has ever felt pressured to act before they were ready, to decide before clarity arrived, then they understand the tension I lived with during those days. It is a heavy thing, carrying responsibility while answers remain incomplete. There were conversations among the men, spoken softly, carefully. They did not challenge me openly, but I could hear the question beneath their words. How long must this continue? When will hiding end? I did not have an answer for them. And leadership, I was learning, sometimes requires the humility to admit that. Instead, I focused on what I could control. How we treated one another. How decisions were made. How restraint was modeled even when frustration grew. Those choices mattered more than I realized at the time. As Saul's pressure increased, I noticed something else changing, not around us, but within me. Fear no longer spiked the way it once had. It was still present, but it no longer dictated my breathing, my thinking, my reactions. That change was subtle, but profound. It came not from the absence of danger, but from repeated practice, from choosing patience again and again, from refusing to let urgency replace wisdom. I began to see how this season was preparing me for moments yet to come, moments where decisions would need to be made publicly, decisively, and without room for retreat. The wilderness was sharpening instincts that could not be learned in safety. If these reflections resonate, it may be because pressure has a way of revealing what lives beneath intention. And sometimes, sharing these inner struggles allows others to see their own endurance more clearly. There is something grounding in knowing that waiting does not mean stagnation, that movement can happen within even when circumstances remain unchanged. Growth is often quiet, nearly invisible, until the moment it is required. As we pressed on, Saul's presence loomed ever closer. The threat sharpened, the margin for error narrowed, and yet I felt prepared in a way I had not before. Not because I was stronger, but because I was steadier. The path ahead would demand more restraint, more clarity, more courage than anything before. I could sense it. The wilderness was not finished teaching me, but I was no longer afraid of what it asked. I walked forward with resolve, carrying not certainty but conviction, and that, I was learning, can sustain a person even when answers remain distant. The moment arrived quietly, without ceremony. Saul was near, closer than he had ever been before, yet I did not act against him. Not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but out of something steadier, something that had been forming silently over months of walking, hiding, and waiting. We had found ourselves on the edge of a narrow valley, the walls of rock pressing close, the wind whispering through the cracks. My men crouched behind me, eyes alert, every muscle taut. Saul and his company moved just beyond the curve, unaware of our presence. The chance to strike, to remove the threat in an instant, pressed against my chest like temptation disguised as reason. It would have been easy. A single act. A moment that could end the chase, bring immediate relief, and perhaps even a sense of justice. But as I watched him, my enemy, my king, the man who had once called me friend, I felt the weight of what mercy truly means. Mercy is not the absence of strength. It is the presence of judgment tempered by restraint. It is seeing another person in their fullness, not just as an obstacle or a threat. I had learned in the wilderness that power is dangerous when combined with fear, that acting from impulse can leave scars far deeper than the danger itself. So I waited, I watched, I let the moment pass without moving a hand toward harm. Saul continued unaware, his focus elsewhere, and then, as if the earth itself conspired to preserve both of us, he and his company moved on. No one spoke for a long time afterward. Silence carried the weight of the choice. My men exhaled quietly, and I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It was a defining lesson. The wilderness had taught me endurance. It had taught patience. It had taught me that the right action is often the one that requires waiting, even when every instinct screams to act. By sparing Saul, I was practicing the kind of leadership that does not demand immediate reward or recognition. I was learning to act from a place of integrity, even when no one else could see it. In the days that followed, reflection became my companion. I thought about how many moments in life present themselves in subtle ways, hidden among fear and frustration. How often we mistake urgency for necessity, forgetting that true courage frequently appears in restraint rather than in action. I also thought about those who had walked with me, the men who had trusted me, followed me, and depended on my judgment. I realized that every choice I made shaped them as much as it shaped me. Leadership is not just about decisions that change circumstances, it is about decisions that shape hearts. The act of mercy carried its own teaching. It showed them and reminded me that strength and compassion can coexist. There were nights when I replayed the moment in my mind, turning it over as if examining a stone in my hand. The temptation had been real. The fear, the desire for immediate resolution had been real. And yet so was the calm that followed the decision to wait. The understanding that some victories are invisible, yet foundational. Some choices are unremarkable in appearance, but monumental in consequence. I often found myself sharing these reflections quietly with my men, not as instruction, but as conversation. Sometimes I would say softly, "The hardest battle is within, the one where you choose restraint over impulse." And they would nod, because they knew it well. They had felt it too. That shared understanding built a bond stronger than any immediate victory could provide. If someone listening has ever faced a moment where acting seemed easier than waiting, they understand this tension. They know how heavy it can feel to carry responsibility, to navigate fear, and to choose the path of patience. Sharing these moments, even in thought, lightens the burden and reminds us that we are not walking alone, even in isolation. As Saul's presence receded for a time, I felt a shift within myself. Not relief from danger. Danger had not disappeared, but a growth in confidence, quiet and enduring. The wilderness had sharpened my instincts. Waiting had tempered my reactions. Restraint had strengthened my resolve. I understood that these inner victories would serve me long after the threats of today had passed. Even now, reflecting on that season, I recognized that the act of mercy was not just about sparing Saul. It was about defining who I wanted to be in the moments that truly matter. It was about learning that patience, faith, and thoughtful action carry a weight far beyond immediate circumstance. And so, the journey continued. The threat still lingered, the path still demanded caution, and yet I walked with a steadier heart. Not because I was fearless, but because I had begun to understand the depth of courage, the quiet power of mercy, and the enduring strength that comes from restraint. If these reflections resonate, perhaps they offer something to carry forward. That the moments we resist impulsive action, that the choices we make from patience rather than fear, are shaping our character far more than the moments of immediate triumph ever could. Sometimes sharing that understanding in thought or conversation allows others to recognize the same potential within themselves. I pressed on, knowing the wilderness was not yet finished teaching me. I had faced fear, practiced restraint, and experienced mercy. And as I walked step by step, I carried not just survival, but understanding. Not just caution, but wisdom. And within that wisdom, a quiet hope that the choices I made today would echo far beyond the hills and valleys of this season. The journey through the wilderness had stretched long and quiet, shaping me in ways I could scarcely have understood at the beginning. Every step, every pause, every decision had been a teacher. I had learned endurance, patience, and restraint. I had learned that courage is not always loud, and that strength often grows in silence. By now, the men who had walked with me were more than companions. They had become witnesses to the slow shaping of a heart determined to walk faithfully, even in the face of danger. They had seen fear tempered, impulses restrained, and mercy chosen when power could have been seized. Their trust, their quiet courage, had reinforced lessons I could not have learned alone. Saul's pursuit had not ended, but it no longer defined my every thought. The wilderness, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a space of clarity. I began to see how each challenge, each narrow path, each hidden cave had prepared me for what truly mattered. Not survival alone, but the shaping of a life capable of leading with integrity, even when circumstances are unstable. I thought often of the invisible lessons that others carry through their own seasons of waiting, those moments that no one else witnesses, yet which mold character more than any public success. The quiet discipline of patience, the decision to act mercifully when anger would be easier, the subtle awareness that every choice touches not only oneself, but others who follow, who depend, who watch. I understood then that this was the true work of leadership, not control, not authority, but steadiness. Not immediate victories, but the consistent practice of restraint, faith, and reflection. It was the kind of learning that could not be rushed, and which could not be measured by applause or recognition. As I walked through the hills one final time before turning toward the next stage of life, I felt a profound stillness within me. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer ruled. Fatigue still lingered, but it did not dictate my decisions. The wilderness had taught me that resilience is built quietly, day by day, step by step. I often found myself reflecting on mercy and on the moments when restraint had preserved life, not only my own, but the life of another who might otherwise have been destroyed by impulse. That realization deepened my understanding of faithfulness. It reminded me that some victories are unseen, some courage unnoticed, yet their impact endures far longer than any visible triumph. And in that stillness, I thought of those who might hear this story someday. Perhaps they will carry their own wildernesses, their own long seasons of waiting and uncertainty. And perhaps in listening, they will recognize that they are not alone, that their patience, their careful choices, their quiet endurance matter. That faithfulness is built not in comfort, but in the persistent effort to walk steadily, even when the path is uncertain. Sometimes I imagine them sitting quietly, reflecting on the weight of choices they have resisted, the times they have restrained anger, the moments they have held mercy in their hands. It is these invisible victories that form the backbone of character, the kind that shapes not just outcomes but lives. If you have felt similar moments, where waiting seemed endless, where fear whispered insistently, where restraint felt almost impossible, perhaps this story offers a mirror, a reminder that endurance carries its own reward, that patience shapes the heart even when circumstances remain unresolved. That mercy and integrity are forms of quiet triumph that echo far beyond what is seen. As I finally left the wilderness behind, each step forward felt lighter, not because the danger had disappeared, Saul's shadow remained, but because the lessons of restraint, endurance, and quiet courage had taken root within me. They had become part of who I was, shaping my responses, my character, and the way I would walk into the world beyond these hills. In the end, it is not the threat that defines us, but the choices we make in response to it. Not the speed of escape, but the steadiness with which we hold our hearts. Not the battles we win, but the restraint we practice, the mercy we offer, and the patience we nurture. If these reflections have reached you, consider them gently. Think of the quiet victories in your own life, the moments of restraint, patience, and mercy that no one else sees but which shape you nonetheless. Perhaps share them with someone you trust, or carry them silently as a reminder of what is possible when a heart chooses steady faithfulness over hurried action. And so the wilderness ends, not as a story of fear, but as a story of growth, of lessons learned in quiet, of strength built in patience, of mercy chosen in moments when it would have been easier to act otherwise. I emerged not unscathed, not untested, but steadier, not defined by threat, but by the choices that had been made along the way. I walked forward into the unknown, carrying the invisible victories, the quiet lessons, and the understanding that life, even when uncertain, can be navigated with courage, patience, and mercy. That is the gift of the wilderness. It does not take away, it shapes. It does not destroy, it prepares. And it reminds every heart willing to listen that endurance is a quiet triumph, far greater than any visible conquest.